Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. I am Daita Sergi, Education Programs Manager with ASHI and a liaison to the Higher Education Association Sustainability Consortium, or HIAS, and I will be introducing today's webinar. It is my pleasure to welcome you all. As many of you know, ASHI's mission is to inspire and catalyze higher education to lead the global sustainability transformation. We're an international association with about 1,000 members spread across the world. We serve as the professional home for campus sustainability staff and offer resources for everyone in higher education. We achieve our mission through a variety of programs and services designed to help members learn from one another, including STARS, our resource hub, the online community, and educational events such as today's webinar. This year's ASHI conference, the Global Conference of Sustainability in Higher Education, will be again 100% virtual and happening October 12th to the 14th. Registration is open now, and I believe there is an early bird registration discount if you register now, and I hope you will join us at the conference. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. Everyone in the audience is on mute, but please feel free to ask questions or provide comments at any point during the presentation. You have two options. Please use the Q&A to ask questions, and you can also upvote questions asked by other attendees and provide comments via the chat pane. If you use the chat, make sure you choose to send your comments to all attendees. If you have additional questions, comments, or suggestions, please email them to education@ashi.org and we will get back to you. At the end of the webinar, you'll have the opportunity to provide feedback regarding today's presentation. We'll take your suggestions into account when planning for future webinars, so please do provide this feedback. Please note this webinar is being recorded. If you experience technical difficulties or have to leave early, you and others can view the recording later. The recording and presentation materials will all be available in the Campus Sustainability Hub after the live broadcast, and you will receive an email once they're posted. Last but not least, let me turn on live transcription, and then you can also turn it on your end if you'd like to see a live transcription of this webinar. But before we go into today's presentation, I wanted to provide a bit more background regarding HIAS, a network of higher education associations with a commitment to advancing sustainability within their constituencies, as well as the entire system of higher education. These forward-thinking organizations share a commitment to collaborating to advance sustainability within their field and higher education broadly. These are professional associations for college and university presidents, chief academic officers, business officers, facilities directors, student affairs and recreation staff, housing officers, procurement officers, and so on. ASHI serves as the coordinating body for HIAS, and today's webinar is offered as an initiative of HIAS. It is also co-sponsored by a number of these associations, SCAP, SHIMA, ACUHOI, and APA. And today we have John Feller, the president of SHIMA, the Campus Safety, Health, and Environmental Management Association, on this webinar. John is also an assistant director with environmental health and safety at Texas A&M University in College Station, Texas. So John, welcome to this webinar and thank you for introducing SHIMA to our audience.
Well, howdy everyone. It's great to be here with you today. And thank you to ASHI for the opportunity to speak about SHIMA. At SHIMA, our mission is to support and educate campus-based EHS professionals and to empower and improve the EHS profession in campus environments. SHIMA is made up of nearly 400 college and university institutional members, which involves over 4,000 campus safety professionals in our association, many of whom have responsibilities related to sustainability initiatives. As a founding member of HIAS, SHIMA is committed to furthering sustainability and educating our members on the many ways in which safety and sustainability intersect. One of our members, you may all know her, Star Scott with the University of Georgia, has been serving for almost 4 years as a special representation liaison to HIAS. In this role, Star works to ensure alignment of and provide support for the sustainability goals of both HIAS and SHIMA. In addition, SHEMA formed an environmental and sustainability community of practice, which provides a space for members to discuss sustainability issues on their campuses. And most recently, our Board of Trustees established a sustainability task force to evaluate how SHEMA includes sustainability, determine steps to stay current with our peers in this effort, and recruit members to deliver more professional development and technical educational opportunities related to sustainability. As professionals concerned with both safety and sustainability, we work to better understand how these things, which are very much two sides of the same coin, affect the 3 Ps: people, places, and profits. And we would love to have you come be a part of what SHEMA is doing on this front. Our annual conference is coming up in July. You can check out our website at www.shema.org. That's CSHEMA.org. I can put that in the chat. But again, we would love to have you come be a part of what we're doing at SHEMA. And thank you again to ASHI for this opportunity to speak about SHEMA.
Thank you so much, John, for being here. And at this time, I will introduce Deborah Rowe, the president of the U.S. Partnership for Education for Sustainable Development, a founder of HIAS, who's working with UN internationally, and a professor of renewable energy, who will get us started.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. You know, the Higher Education Association Sustainability Consortium is about 18 years old. The member associations recognize that fulfilling their mission in the 21st century requires this broader, systemic, collaborative approach to their own work and that of the constituents that they serve. And look at who they are. They are the, presidential and provost associations, the facilities staff, of course, ASHI, housing officers, SHEMA, as you just heard, student affairs, the Sustainable Labs Group, auxiliary services, business officers, procurement staff, the National Council for Workforce Education, these college and university planners, and more. So over the years, they have compiled resources for you so that you can learn from the successful precedents. And I encourage you to check out at that link. It's just ashi.org/HIAS, because ASHI hosts the website for us. All of these resources that exist from all of these associations, plus what we've done collaboratively to make a difference for a sustainable future. We have for you, and it's all free there, the primer for your presidents, your senior administrators, your trustees. We also have an initiative called Beyond Doom and Gloom, because so many students are getting doomed and gloomed by climate change, and so many of your staff and community members too. So we have a policy partner network where people can engage in those systemic solutions that we need. And there's a lot of activity going on now. So please do, we've got to do more than vote, right? We've got to get engaged in getting the policies that we need, both in our organizations at the local, state, and federal level. That's how we create a vibrant democracy. So you can go to that link and learn more about that and join the network. We also know that it's got to be institutionalized. So we're putting sustainability into job descriptions and performance appraisals. We have resources for you there. Lots of resources, including a new one I want to highlight called projectsthatmatter.org. It's actually a matchmaking site where researchers, practitioners for the Sustainable Development Goals, students, and volunteers can collaborate on projects. So if you want assignments that really matter in the world for your students, or if you're a staff and you're looking for the co-curricular or community events, please go. You can post your projects at projectsthatmatter.org, but you can also find projects that you can participate in. But at this time, what I'd like to do is remind you to put your questions in the chat. I have a feeling, not in the chat, in the questions and answers. I have a feeling the chat's going to be busy with you all talking to each other and sharing resources, and we encourage you to do that. You can share with us where you're feeling that you're kind of stuck on something, or you have a specific question. But the areas where you're feeling stuck, or the specific questions that you have, please put into the question and answer portion of the webinar, That way we'll be able to find them quickly and get to them during our question and answer session. All right, so at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Tilden Chow. Tilden will moderate the panel. He is an undergraduate at Yale University. He's the founder and director of the Yale Refrigerants Initiative, a grant-funded project aimed at developing refrigerant management solutions on university campuses. He holds the EPA Section 608 certification, so he's built some of the skills himself in refrigerant handling. He will start with a brief overview of the event. I also want to thank him because he really helped to put this event together, and we will all benefit by the many tons of greenhouse gases that will be reduced when we implement the information from today. Tilden?
Well, thank you, Dr. Rowe, and it's great to be here with you all today. Today's event will run for 90 minutes and will cover the climate science of refrigerants, forthcoming regulations that will affect refrigeration in facilities, and strategies to manage and document refrigerants on campus. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miranda Gorman, Senior Research Fellow at Project Drawdown. Dr. Gorman will discuss the climate impacts of refrigerant gases and the sustainable alternative refrigerants on the market today. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box for Dr. Gorman to answer at the end of her presentation. Thank you and welcome, Dr. Gorman.
Thanks so much, Tilden, for that introduction. I hope everyone can see my slides. So yes, as Tilden said, I am Miranda Gorman. I'm the Senior Research Fellow for Industry at Project Drawdown, which means that I'm responsible for all of our research that's related to materials and waste and circular economy. And one of those very important things is refrigerants. So I want to give you a little bit of background about our organization today, some of the research that we do, and some of our key findings in this area. The name of the organization, Project Drawdown, is about the point in time when we actually start to remove carbon from the atmosphere and draw it down. So basically the goal is to identify real world existing technological solutions that can be implemented at scale that would contribute to achieving this goal, to actually reducing the concentrations of CO2 in our atmosphere and of all greenhouse gases to prevent global climate change, as opposed to just trying to limit emissions or something like that. We really identify a whole scope of existing technological solutions. We also are really focused on identifying solutions that already exist and can be implemented right now at scale. So the way that this research is framed is basically there's two major categories that are identified, sources and sinks. So these fall into several different categories, as I said. The one that I think people are typically thinking about when they're thinking about climate change mitigation and those types of activities is electricity right here. Electricity is sort of transitioning away from fossil fuels into cleaner and renewable energy sources. Some of our other major sectors of research that we do include food, agriculture, and land use, which is another major source of emissions. The industry sector, that's my sector. Transportation and buildings, these are all sources of emissions. So these are anthropogenic sources of greenhouse gas emissions. The other sort of large grouping of solutions and sectors that we investigate are sinks. So thinking about ways in which we can promote our environment to absorb CO2. So that would be land sinks, coastal and ocean sinks, as well as engineered sinks, which is a fairly new, both of these two, ocean and engineered sinks, are sort of newer areas of research for us that we're doing a lot of activity in right now. And then the final one is society. So thinking about how society impacts the climate and the environment and how we can sort of leverage change in those areas to promote a more sustainable society. So like I said, this is sort of a representation of the major sectors that we have. So the sources which emit greenhouse gases that are absorbed into the atmosphere, and then sinks that absorb sources on the left and sort of like come to a more equal balance, imbalance here. one of the things that I do want to point out is that all of the research that we do and all of the investigations into all of these individual solutions, I'll just go back for 1 second to show you. So within all of these different sectors, we have multiple clusters, and within all of these clusters, we have multiple solutions. So there's upwards of 80 solutions that we've identified that fit into all of these categories, but they all exist really in this integrated ecosystem, how they all relate to each other. And all of these system boundaries for each solution in each sector are defined in such a way that they are that they relate to each other and they're necessary for each individual solution. So people I think look at the drawdown solutions, and we do research that involves actually identifying what we think the actual carbon emissions reduction potential is for each one of these solutions from now until 2050. But what that depends upon is really knowing that each solution wouldn't be possible without all of the other solutions, and they're limited by some of these other solutions. So just taking one out of context, it doesn't necessarily make sense, because just like our environment, just like this system that you see right here, everything is fully integrated. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the industry sector and the research that's going on in here. So in the industry sector, there's sort of 3 main clusters of solutions that have been identified. First one is using waste. So preventing things from getting to landfill, preventing things from being wasted and unrecovered is a really big opportunity for a more sustainable society, as well as improving materials, not using non-renewable resources in that way, identifying opportunities for improvement in that sense. And then addressing refrigerants is actually our biggest opportunity. So what we're looking at right here are these bubbles, which are actually to scale. So these are these are to scale with the actual identified emissions reduction potential. So there's 2 refrigerant solutions that we've identified so far. There used to be just one, but in order to get sort of a higher resolution look at the refrigerant system, we split it up into 2 solutions. So there's 2 solutions within this bubble. The first one is alternative refrigerants, and the second one is refrigerant management. And I'm going to just dig in a little bit to talk about some of the key results that we found and really highlight why this is such a huge opportunity and why it really should be at the forefront of everyone's minds when we're thinking about sustainability. Like I said, this is sort of just blowing them up and giving you a little bit more context in terms of the numbers. So the numbers that you see here, this 43.5, 50, and then this 57.7 are actually the identified potential emissions reductions in gigatons of CO2 equivalents that have been identified for both of these 2 solutions. The way that we do our analysis is we develop multiple scenarios. So what you're looking at here, the reason there's 2 numbers is there's 2 scenarios with varying degrees of aggression, basically, and ambition. So the first scenario, all the drawdown solutions together are sort of correlated to a 1.5 degree warming goal, and the second one is that the first one is correlated to the 2 degree warming goal, and the second more aggressive scenario is correlated to the 1.5 degree warming goal from IPCC. So this is a look at all of the drawdown solutions from all of the sectors. As I mentioned, refrigerants are really high up. So out of all of our 80-something solutions, they actually rank numbers 4 and 7 in our first scenario. So scenario 1, which we call the plausible scenario. It is relevant to note that before these got split up into 2 different solutions in the original version of this research, they were combined, and it was actually the number 1 solution. So, I still consider it to be probably the most impactful solution, even though we look at it as 2 separate solutions right now. So I just want to dive in a little bit to some of the key findings that we found. So refrigerant management is a solution that is really thinking about managing leaks and managing disposal of refrigerants. So of our existing systems, making sure that we are managing the HFCs, as well as if there is implementation of alternative refrigerants, managing all refrigerants in a more responsible way. So I think, as a lot of us know, HFCs have really, really high global warming potentials, upwards of 1,000 times that of CO2. Some estimates show, up to 9,000 times. So the greenhouse gas, the global warming potential of these gases is just like astronomical. So one of the most important things that we can do is just be really careful about how we deal with them. So that includes collection at end of life and destruction. Can also include, being transformed into other materials that may be, that could be reused. So our estimates show that potentially 80% of these unmanaged leakages and releases could potentially be contained. So we see that to be a feasible goal that's identified over the next 3 decades. So if we slowly accomplish that between now and 2050, as I mentioned, the potential greenhouse gas savings are up close to 58 gigatons of CO2. So that's, it's a huge, huge opportunity. The other thing that we have identified is that there is actually a net cost for this. So there is a cost to implementing these solutions, but the benefits, I think, far outweigh the cost. The next sort of part of the refrigerants ecosystem is alternative refrigerants. So as I mentioned, HFCs have an extremely high global warming potential. So another way of thinking about how to improve the system is replacing those HFCs with alternatives. Some of the key alternatives that we've identified include ammonia, captured CO2, and propane, and they can replace these fluorinated gases. They oftentimes still do contribute to global warming, but are at have much, much lower global warming potentials. So implementation of this is really critical. And for the two sort of solutions that we've identified, we think that there's an opportunity to replace between 67 and 82% of HFCs by 2050. And what that results in is between 43 and 50 gigatons of reduction for those two scenarios, respectively. And again, I just want to point out that these two scenarios, alternative refrigerants and refrigerant management, both need to happen in conjunction for these goals to be accomplished. You can't just pick one out and say, oh, for example, the impact of refrigerant management is 58 gigatons, whereas alternative refrigerants is between 53 and 50. So let's just focus on one versus the other. That's not at all how this works. It's really important to think about both of these things, how they work in a combined system. So that's sort of all that I wanted to share with everyone, to just give you a picture of the research that we do at Drawdown, as well as some of the key results and findings from our refrigerants, to really highlight at a global scale, if this is implemented in a complete way, there's really a huge, huge opportunity for impact. And the other thing that's really critical to realize is that these greenhouse gases, if we take action now, a lot of times they're referred to as super pollutants, but the impact now is really very critical and can have a very fast impact on the climate moving forward. So thank you all so much for your attention. Happy to take any questions, and I'll turn it back over to you, Tilden.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gorman, and thanks for your talk. We have one question in the chat from Michael from New Yorkers for Cool Refrigerant Management. He asks, does Drawdown's model include greenhouse gas effects of the ozone depleting substances such as chlorofluorocarbon, CFC, and hydrochlorofluorocarbon, HCFC?
Yeah, so we basically it's replacement of fluorinated gases, so primarily HFCs. I can actually, I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I will check and I'll answer you in the chat right now, if that's okay. And then I saw another question about the alternative refrigerants cost, and we don't currently have a cost modeled for that because there's just so much variability in terms of the different materials that you use and things like that. So we don't have a cost modeled for that right now.
I'll be addressing costs.
Oh, good. Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And I think this is a good segue into our second presentation. And thank you to Dr. Gorman and for the discussion. And we'll return to any lingering questions from this presentation at the end. Now we're excited to welcome Kristen Tedonio, the Senior Climate and Energy Advisor at the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development and the leader of the Climate Friendly Cooling Project. Welcome, Kristen, and thanks for being here.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. All right, can everybody see this? Fantastic. So thanks so much, Tilden and Miranda. What a great act to follow. My name is Kristen Tedonio. As Tilden said, I work for an organization called the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development that has been focused on F-gases and other super climate pollutants for the last 2 decades. Prior to joining IDSD, I worked at the US Department of Energy in the Building Technologies Group, working on commercial building technology deployment projects in the Better Buildings program. And before that, I was at EPA working on HFCs, refrigerants, and the Energy Star Appliance program. So I come to this from a background working with diverse stakeholders, and really happy to talk to you all today. So I'm going to be talking about how we can stay cool without warming the planet and the new regulatory landscape for refrigerants and how you could potentially benefit from taking the climate-friendly cooling pledge. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about primarily 4 things. First, why are lawmakers focused on efficient equipment and climate-friendly refrigerants? Secondly, how can procurement and your organizational policy potentially help you be prepared? I'll tell you a little bit about where you can find today products that already contain climate-friendly refrigerants and alternatives to these very potent HFCs, and a little bit about where to find the climate-friendly cooling pledge. All right, so first, why are we focused on energy efficiency and climate-friendly refrigerants? Well, the world has been discussing refrigerants for quite a while, starting with the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And many of the negotiators of that treaty, which was initially executed in the 80s and implemented throughout the 90s and is still under effect today, realized that a lot of the alternatives to CFCs were HFCs. And although HFCs do have much lower global warming potentials than the CFCs, they still do have a significant impact on the Earth's climate. And as more of the world develops and more of the world especially adopts cooling appliances, air conditioning, refrigerators, and what have you, the impacts were growing exponentially. So scientists got together and they looked at the projections out through mid-century and the end of the century, and they realized, whoa, if we don't get a handle on things, if we don't kind of put a cap on the HFC global warming potential now, we're going to see another 0.5 degree Celsius of warming. So said another way, if we can eliminate the climate impacts of refrigerant or significantly reduce it, we can avoid 0.5 degree Celsius warming this century when we most need to avoid that warming. And then combining that with energy efficiency, so making sure we focus on transitioning to more energy efficient products and cooling devices, can help us avoid another 0.5 degree C of warming. So we're talking about a 1 degree C impact, which is pretty big when you're talking about trying to stay below 1.5. Increasingly in the US, state and national laws are mandating a switch to climate-friendly alternatives to HFCs. And the good news is many energy efficient, affordable options are available now, and many more will likely be available very soon due to some very recent regulatory and federal action. All right, so we've covered this. High efficiency plus climate-friendly refrigerants gives you the best possible outcome. It minimizes both your direct and indirect climate impacts, and financially, it can minimize your life cycle ownership costs by 1, making sure that you're not wasting energy for your products and equipment, and 2, making sure that you're not going to be using a refrigerant that's going to be expensive as scarcity becomes a real issue. So the 2016 Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, Dr. Gorman mentioned this, but I just wanted to give you all an update and a link that you can watch at your leisure. It has entered into force. Currently, there are well over 100 countries that have ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, and the United States has recently passed legislation putting us on a similar schedule. So what does the Kigali Amendment do? It formally phases down, not out, phases down the climate impacts of hydrofluorocarbons. So on the right here, you can see the schedule for developed countries to phase down the climate impacts of their HFC consumption. And on the left, this is what scientists believe would have happened without controls under Kigali, and then the likely scenario with full adoption of the Kigali Amendment. So in the United States, industry has always been a strong supporter of the Kigali Amendment. This is a notice from the US Chamber of Commerce in 2018. Chemical manufacturers, a lot of the product manufacturers were also very supportive of the Kigali Amendment and pushed for a law in the United States that would phase down HFCs on a similar timeframe to keep the United States in competition with and in compliance and cooperation with the rest of the world. Doesn't really help us if we're all doing one thing and the rest of the world's doing another. So in December of last year, so actually signed into law by President Trump, was a new law colloquially known as the AIM Act, the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act, which does just this. In a nutshell, it phases down the climate impacts of HFC production and consumption on the same schedule as the Kigali Amendment. And it also empowers the Environmental Protection Agency to set restrictions on the global warming potential of HFCs used in certain products and end uses, as well as additional regulatory powers to set requirements for training, certification, what have you. So this is very notable. If you did not know about this before, please take note. There's some resources that are linked in this presentation, but it's important to note that what this phase down is it is a GWP, a global warming potential weighted phase down. So in other words, we can use the same amount of refrigerant as long and still meet these requirements so long as we switch to alternatives that have lower global warming potentials and or we manage our existing refrigerants well. So what does this mean for me and how do I prepare? So I put together just some thoughts that if you haven't thought about this before, you may want to. If you are a producer or an importer of bulk high global warming potential HFCs, this impacts you directly. EPA is currently making rules that allocate the allowances to produce or to import HFCs. Chances are if you're in that seat, you are prepared and you have seen this coming for a long time. If not, fire your government relations person, or no, don't do that. Give me a call or talk to your trade association. But most of us are in the other seat. We are consumers of high global warming potential HFCs, not necessarily intentionally, but because we buy things like air conditioners, or if we have facilities, we maintain chillers, supermarket refrigeration equipment, what have you. So now is really the time to make a plan if you don't have one already. So a few suggestions. One, consider setting an organizational HFC policy and conduct an inventory of your air conditioning and refrigeration equipment. Find out what refrigerants they use and how often you're servicing them and adding refrigerant. If your organization has a greenhouse gas inventory, you may already have this information because refrigerants are included in scope 1. They are a direct emissions source. So you should, if you have a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory, already have at least some of this information available. Work with your maintenance teams to make sure that when equipment is replaced, your organization is prioritizing not just energy efficient options, but also options that use climate-friendly alternatives. The EPA, although they have the power to limit specific HFCs or the global warming potential of HFCs used in products and equipment, it will likely be several years until we see those regulations finalized and going into effect. So what you want to avoid happening in the meantime is being sold a product that uses the last generation of refrigerants, because there may be some discounts, let's say, that happen in the future as people try and get rid of their inventory of old product before switching to the new refrigerant options. Be aware of what your state's laws are. Over the last 4 years, under the Trump administration, a lot of states moved ahead and set their own phase down requirements for HFCs, including end use restrictions. In some states, it is illegal to purchase and install an air conditioner or a heat pump that uses a refrigerant with a global warming potential over 750, starting January 1, 2025. HRI has petitioned EPA to set a national phase down requirement, likely on a similar timescale. So what this means is that up until then, you'll likely be able to find products using the high global warming potential gases, but we're likely very soon to start seeing product that contains the low global warming potential gases. This is particularly true of the medium size residential and commercial air conditioners and heat pumps, because EPA just finalized some new rules permitting new refrigerants, and building codes have been updated as well and are in the process of being adopted. Okay, so for consumer and other business product, things like domestic refrigerators, freezers, room air conditioners, even lab grade refrigerators and freezers, the good news is low GWP products are already plentiful, and we've developed a list for you. So if you go to climatefriendlycooling.com, you will see a comprehensive list broken out by product type of the energy efficient, Energy Star qualified where possible products that use low GWP refrigerants. Okay, so this is where you can go, hfcbans.com, if you want to check out what's going on in your state. So how can purchasers and policy help? Well, we encourage everybody to consider looking at our guidance. At climatefriendlycooling.com, you can find procurement guidance that was developed in partnership by the IGSD, my organization, and the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. It helps you commit to purchasing low global warming potential efficient products, to calculate the costs of ownership, including refrigerant service and energy use, reduce refrigerant leakage by monitoring the system, and then dispose of products properly at end of life, which is really important. Although it is illegal to vent refrigerant in the United States, currently it is estimated that over half of air conditioning systems have their refrigerant just vented to the atmosphere at the end of life. So that is something we want to make sure doesn't happen at our facilities. So a new version of the procurement recommendations is currently being updated. It is available at climatefriendlycooling.com. The updated version by the end of the summer will be posted there as well. And then just some examples of some quick wins. So what are some climate-friendly refrigerant products available now? Refrigerators, freezers, vending machines, heat pump water heaters even, commercial refrigerators and ice makers. There are a number of air conditioners in the chiller range. There's low GWP options. In the very small air conditioner range, there's low GWP options, climate-friendly options. It's been that in-between range where we're lacking product, but we're starting to see that coming available now. And then most vehicle air conditioners at this point have transitioned as well. So just some example of where you can find information on efficient standalone commercial refrigerated display cases, ice makers, if you have those in your facilities, lab grade refrigerators, if there's anybody from the State Sustainable Labs initiative here. The great news is that there's over 600 lab grade models that are both Energy Star qualified and already use low global warming potential options, plus many more product types. So one final entreaty to all of you. If you've seen this, if you agree that it's important to take action on climate-friendly refrigerants, consider taking the climate-friendly cooling pledge. And it is as simple as saying that I or we, if you're on behalf of your organization, pledge to buy products that save money and help the environment by seeking out efficient options that don't contain high global warming potential chemicals that are damaging to the Earth's climate. So please consider joining IGSD, SPLC, and others, including Yale, in taking the pledge. So a recap, switching to climate-friendly alternatives to highly potent greenhouse gas HFCs can avoid 0.5 degree C of warming. The phase down has already begun worldwide and here in the United States with the passage of the American Innovation and Manufacturing Act. Your organizational policy and procurement practices are very important, and it may be time to update them to prioritize climate-friendly options. And a toolkit and resources are available to help you make smart purchasing decisions. So please do go to climatefriendlycooling.com for guidance and consider taking the pledge. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And it looks like we have a bunch of great questions in the chat. Let's start with one about transitioning existing products to low GWP alternatives. So the question is, if I want to buy a low GWP refrigerator, do I have to buy a whole new product, or can I just drop in a substitute to replace that HFC?
You don't want to drop in a substitute for existing equipment most of the time. So in most cases, a product, be it a refrigerator, an air conditioner, a supermarket refrigerator, is designed around the use of a particular refrigerant. So we never want to be in a position where we're tampering with that. But what we do want to do is make sure that when it comes time to replace that product, that we're replacing it with an option that uses climate-friendly refrigerants or alternatives. The other thing that is possible is to make sure that when that old refrigerator reaches the end of its life and you're recycling it, that it is recycled properly and not just taken to a dump somewhere where they cut the refrigerant line and vent it. So you can do that. There's a great program run by the US EPA, the Responsible Appliance Disposal, or RAD program. Many common retailers are partners in it. So that means that, oftentimes, I'll get on the phone with Sears or Lowe's, buy a new refrigerator, and they'll come pick up my old one free of charge. Very convenient. If that facility is a partner, a RAD partner, then there is some extra assurance that that old refrigerator will be properly disposed of and the refrigerant recovered and destroyed or recycled.
Fantastic, thank you. And one question about Energy Star. Does the Energy Star rating currently take into account low GWP into considerations as well as energy efficiency? And if not, where can you find information that incorporates both energy efficiency and low GWP refrigerants?
Sure, so now you can find that at climatefriendlycooling.com. We simply start with the Energy Star product lists, and then we screen for the usage of climate-friendly refrigerants. We also have petitioned the Energy Star program to consider the HFC content when establishing their labeling practices. So right now, Energy Star does consider factors other than just energy use. So there is a precedent for Energy Star considering additional environmental factors, but they have not yet chosen to restrict the global warming potential of refrigerants or the foams used in products. So actually a big issue too is not just the refrigerants, but foam blowing agents. It's like if you have that pink insulation in your walls, in your buildings, that historically has used very potent HFCs. Same with appliances. The foam in appliances can use potent HFCs. Since those emissions are not really addressable via servicing, right? That's more of an organizational policy that you're going to select if you're doing major new construction, climate-friendly insulation. But the good news is we're very hopeful that EPA will soon restrict the use of the highly potent HFCs in those insulation products as well.
Fantastic. And one more question just for the audience. I've seen some people who are concerned about the safety and the reliability of these new generations of refrigerants. So can you maybe speak about the safety, especially for people who are concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. So there has been a bit of fear mongering about the potential flammability of some alternatives. If you have purchased a car in the last 10 years and you're driving it, you already are using a what's called an A2L refrigerant. So that means that the refrigerant may be mildly flammable, similar to olive oil, actually less so. So it's a very low flammability. There's rigorous testing by a number of safety organizations and institutions. There are code requirements around the safety of these refrigerants too. So I can assure you that anything that does make it into an end-use product has gone through the gauntlet. The other thing is that, you know, the United States is really behind the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, R32, which is a mildly flammable refrigerant, has been used for a very long time in air conditioners and heat pumps. In the United States, we have only recently started to adopt that. So, I mean, what I envision is there will potentially be a little bit of pushback in the HVACR industry, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and refrigeration. But for the other products, you know, if you've bought a refrigerator in the last 5 years, there's a good chance you're already using 290 in it because, or R600A, which is mildly flammable. But the refrigerant charge sizes are much, much smaller. Like if you have a Zippo in your pocket, you may be at greater risk. So, you know, all of this is relative. The other thing that I'll also note is that a lot of refrigerants today are not used as straight refrigerants. They're mixed with products, often lubricants that are flammable already. So a lot of this you have to kind of take into perspective. And then finally, you know, for buildings, we have this phenomenal opportunity to, you know, as building electrification becomes an issue, as we decarbonize the electricity sector, there's this increasing interest in, well, can we reduce the climate impacts of buildings by using more heat pumps and technologies like that? And, you know, heat pumps use a very small charge size of refrigerant. There are non-flammable options on the market or coming to the market soon, for instance, but there's a lot of non-patented mildly flammable options. We have the opportunity to have a limited amount to replace essentially unlimited quantities of much higher flammability gas. So from an overall risk perspective, you know, this could potentially wind up reducing risk, but I'd be happy to talk offline extensively and connect folks with some of the great trade associations that are doing a lot of work on this right now.
Fantastic. Thank you to Kristen and thank you to all for a fantastic discussion. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce Jim Romanski, a power plant manager at Yale University and a lecturer at the University of Hartford. Jim manages the HVAC equipment and refrigerants in large industrial chillers at Yale Power Plant and will discuss best practices in refrigerant management and a case study of Yale's own practices. Welcome, Jim, and thank you.
Hi, Tilden. Let me get my presentation here. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jim Romanski, and I currently work at Yale University. Previously, I worked for Pratt & Whitney in a kind of a similar capacity. And while refrigerant management hasn't been my primary focus, it's always been part of my job title. So this is our ozone layer, cute little graphic, just to remind folks our ozone layer is not close to us. It's above the troposphere. It's in the stratosphere. I want to mention that when I first got into this, I had a lot of trouble believing that refrigerants, which are very heavy, got up to the stratosphere. And I was told by some scientists that that's because I was thinking about when it would leak a batch of it would not rise up into the air because it's heavy, but it gets there through simple diffusion. So it's more on a molecular basis than a charge of refrigerant. So it does get there, and because it's so persistent, that's why the concentrations build up in the stratosphere. So I'm going to talk about a case study and about how we manage refrigerant at Yale University currently. And this is also how we did this back when I was at Pratt & Whitney, in a similar way. So I should mention from the start that when I teach an air pollution class, refrigerants are similar to gasoline. They're substances they're not intended to leak. We don't want them to leak at all. But because a lot of them are under high pressures and they have demanding duty cycles, automobiles are like a torture test for refrigerants because they're exposed to the elements. They end up leaking. So unlike combustion equipment that emits carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct that you can't really get around, refrigerant is a product. So kind of like back when they started to regulate gasoline, people didn't want to spend the money for the equipment, but then they found that, gee, they were preventing the release of an actual product, and refrigerant is the same way. So a lot of people are on board doing proper management just because it saves money and it's good for the environment at the same time. So here's some pictures of residential equipment. The residential equipment is usually has a very small charge. I'm going to be talking a lot about larger equipment that has a greater than 50-pound charge, and I'll explain why. So the window units or central air conditioners, they have much smaller charges. You also have some commercial equipment where you've got some units that are maybe out in a courtyard, or you've got some equipment that's up on the roof. When you get into the bigger equipment, you might have some chillers and equipment that are on the roof and that are using cooling fans to cool their condenser coils. But generally speaking, for a power plant, you'd be looking at some kind of a large chiller. And these chillers, they don't use fans and air to cool their hot side. What they do is they use cooling towers and they use water to evaporate and cool. So they're using the latent heat of vaporization, which is a lot more efficient way to cool down. But as you can imagine, having a cooling tower and a large system like this is quite complicated. So it's more efficient, but it's really only available to people who are going to do cooling on a large scale. So Tilden asked me to talk about a little bit about leak detection too. So detecting leaks, so the common way people detect leaks, the most common method is that your equipment stops making cold. And you know that something's happened to the charge. So somebody goes out to look for the leak, and there's a number of ways you can do that. So one of the ways is with some kind of a sniffer device, a handheld unit that some are specific to certain refrigerants, some have multiple gases that they can look for, and you can use these to go around and sniff for leaks. Another way, a couple other ways that they do that is you can put dye into the refrigerant, and then over here on the left, you can look for some of it that gets leaked out, and you find it by this colored dye. And then an old tried and true method is just to use a spray bottle with soapy water, and you can find leaks that way very well. This is how they find the leak in your tire at the gas station, or at the tire place. If you've got a leak in your tire, they usually put your tire into a little water bath and look for bubbles. But this is still a useful and valid method. So those are ways that technicians will go and look for leaks. So let me talk about our program. And early on, before the recent HFCs, our initial program, we were just looking at ozone depleting substances class 1 and class 2. And the first thing we wanted to do was to develop an inventory. We needed to identify who the refrigerant technicians were and review the record keeping. And then the final thing we ended up doing was purchasing some refrigerant compliance management software. So when we developed an inventory, you start at the power plants, which has the largest volume of refrigerant. And the good thing about the power plants is that these are people who are already used to handling large scale equipment and managing it. So instead of just waiting till a chiller is underperforming and can't quite make temperature to send a technician to look at it, which they would do if happened, just about every power plant in the Northeast around March sometime, they're calling up their maintenance contractors to come in and service their equipment, and they'll go over this and they'll service it because they want to make sure that everything's good to go before the cooling season starts. And it's usually sometime in May. At Yale we have year-round cooling because we have some research facilities that require environmentally perfect temperatures. So we do have a small load of chilling year-round. And then we also had some other facilities, larger facilities that were not serviced by the power plant, such as some libraries, hospital, medical centers, food services. And so one of the things we found very useful is to meet with the people who actually do the servicing. And so again, at the power plants, it was a different batch of people. They usually hire contractors. A lot of times they're from the companies that actually provide the equipment because they have particular expertise. So, we have equipment from Carrier, and York, and Trane as an example. I'm not advocating anybody's particular equipment, but those are 3 companies that we use. And then you have some of these other units around campus, and it turned out that we had, when I first got there, I didn't really know this, but I met our own Yale certified refrigeration technicians. And so all these people can take you around and show you the units. And when I first assessed the system, I looked at the record keeping, and no surprise, I found that the professionals doing the power plants, they are generally very knowledgeable about the EPA requirements, and their record keeping, I considered it to be adequate and met the letter of the law, though not centralized and maybe not so easy to review and look at trends. And for the refrigeration technicians, most of the work they were doing was on units that were less than 50-pound charge, which are still important units, but they don't have the same record keeping requirements that greater than 50-pound units do. So the other thing we did is we purchased some refrigerant compliance software. The old standby was this package called RCM, and for the longest time, they were the only ones who made refrigerant compliance software. They were bought out, seemed like every year was a different company that owned them, but they kept chugging along. They're currently owned by a company named Spira. Not necessarily advocating that software, but we had it for many years, so we continue to use it. It does a good enough job. But nowadays there are many other players in the market. So using the software, it's handy because it gives you kind of a template for the information required. It will track, you can keep track of your technician certifications. It'll kick out forms that have exactly what you need to have the technicians fill in order to calculate leak rates. And you can also use it to manage your service equipment. So here's our old compliance checklist. So we maintain copies of certifications of our technicians. Oops, sorry, jumped ahead there. And we would do leak rate calculations. Now, I'm going to say right off the top of this that every time, our policy was every time that somebody went out and did service on a unit, unless they were like changing a belt, anything that involved either adding or taking out refrigerant, we asked them to just assume that we had to do a leak rate calculation, because we might not get the paperwork until later and may be calculating the leak rate a little later, and we may not find out that we exceeded the leak rate right away. So we told them that anytime you put in or take out refrigerant, assume that it's going to blow the leak rate, even though most of the time it doesn't, and make sure that you fill in all the information that we need. And that the important parts were the initial leak test that they do when they basically they take out the refrigerant, they fix the leak, they put nitrogen in the system, they pressurize it. If it holds pressure, then they fill it with refrigerant, and they come back within 30 days to do a follow-up verification to make sure that it's not leaking again. Some of the other requirements, there's retrofit retirement plans if needed. The older regs, and they had limited leak reporting. You kept track of your refrigerant, and I'm afraid that this little bar, I can't see my whole presentation. There it is. Put it up here. And then there was a one-time notification for your actual reclamation equipment. So along came the regulation of HFC refrigerants. Now, I should just explain that this got walked back, and Kristen didn't mention anything about this, but I believe that there's a move afoot in EPA to bring this back. So at Yale, we started to manage things because actual compliance dates came around before they walked back the leak repair regulations on HFCs. So we just decided to keep doing it as a best practice, because we figured that when a new administration came along, that we might go back to where we were, and maybe even a little bit different. So adding the HFCs greatly expanded the inventory of units we had to keep track of. And there were some new requirements, and we had more contractors to identify. And really what this did is me and one or two other folks managed the refrigerant compliance program kind of on the side of our other jobs. But the universe of unit to manage became so large that we decided to hire somebody full-time as a refrigerant compliance manager. So we hired a guy named Kyle to do that. Kyle is in the Army Reserves, and right now he's out serving the country. So we're back taking care of the program until he returns. So, the expansion, there were more units of power plant, there were some larger facilities not served. We had more libraries, museums, hospitals, walk-in coolers, rooftop units. And I have here active units. I want to show you, I have an inventory here in Excel. Let's find my Excel. There we go. Sorry, folks. I don't. Oh, show all windows. Here it is. So this is a this is kind of just a snapshot of units that we have. And so I made the ones in yellow are the ODS class 2 units. We got rid of the class 1s, and then here are the HFCs in blue. And so now we have more units, more HFC units than we do class 2 units. However, the largest amount of refrigerant is still part of the class 2 refrigerants. I have a tab here. These are units that we took out of service. So we took a lot of class 1s out of service. We took a lot of class 2s out of service. And as you'd expect, not as many of HFC units because they were newer. So getting back to the presentation. So the new program, as it was designed, and when EPA brings this back, it may look the same. There may be some changes, but the big changes were the inclusion of more refrigerants. They did lower some of the leak rate thresholds. There were some additional methods of calculation that you could do, more details in service records. And they added some things like leak inspection. So this would be required if you had a leak rate that exceeded a certain number. And these were called chronic leakers, which people kind of liked that. They thought that name was funny. Some people thought it referred to some Washington legislators. Some other people said that they had an older uncle they thought was a chronic leaker. So we also had some expanded reporting for all leak provisions. And one of the big changes as well was this record keeping for units between 5 and 50 pound charges of how you disposed of them. So kind of like manifesting like a waste program. So you can see there are a lot more things going on, and that is why we ended up hiring somebody to run the program full time. And let me kind of go through this. I think my time's up, so let me just go through this really quickly, just to talk about phasing out. So you want to be planning for phase out of R22 and for the HFC. And so these are some slides I have from a previous presentation. Here's the old schedule for class 2, and if you look at it, you'll see that we're already at the bottom. At 2020, 99.5% reduction in HCFC consumption and production from the baseline, and in 2030, it's supposed to hit 100%. So you can look at this slide on your own. These are some other uses for HCFCs. Some more discussion of the detail about the R22 phase out, but I'll come back down to this last slide here. Which mentions that as of January 2020, which were passed, no new or imported R22. So the only source is going to come from recycled and reclaimed R22. And some of this wasn't as well thought out because some of the inventory that they accounted for was really less than what they thought. And so the bottom line is that we're pretty sure there's going to be a shortage of R22, which will most certainly affect the price. People want to plan for that. And that's it. Any questions?
Great. Thank you, Jim, for the presentation and for the case study at Yale. Glad to learn from you every day. We're going to quickly transition to our inventory talk with Dan Smith from Bard College, but I welcome Jim and others to answer questions typing in the Q&A box. But just for time, we'll move on here.
Okay.
So I'll pull up my slides right here. So Jim, maybe you can pull down your slides so I can put mine up.
Okay.
Thank you.
What do we do? Pause or stop share? There we go.
Great. Thank you. So it's my pleasure today to be presenting about refrigerant inventories with Dan Smith from Bard College. And Dan and I have also received great help from BARD's Chief Sustainability Officer, Lori Husted. And Dan himself has particular expertise in refrigerant inventories. In addition to spearheading one on Bard College's campus, he also completed a refrigerant inventory for the city of Kingston, New York. Refrigerant inventories are not only a key process for colleges and universities, but also for buildings and facilities in general. So we're excited to tell you about why they matter, what they are, and how to conduct them. First off, why conduct a refrigerant inventory? Well, a refrigerant inventory is a list of refrigeration and air conditioning equipment. It's identifying information and the refrigerant used. And it's similar to a typical greenhouse gas inventory, but it focuses on air conditioning and refrigeration. It also has key and broad benefits for universities and institutions. Some of them are procurement and maintenance strategies, identifying emissions and reduction reports, and also simplifying compliance and reporting for greenhouse gases. And throughout this talk today, you might have had some questions circulating in your mind, and hopefully these inventories can answer some of them. First off, you can answer questions such as, what proportion of HVAC equipment in my building uses HFCs and HCFCs and CFCs, fluorinated gases? Where are the largest sources of refrigerant emissions on campus? Where is aging or inefficient equipment located? What is estimated climate impact from refrigerant leakage annually? And which high impact zones on my campus can be most easily mitigated in terms of refrigerant emissions? So to conduct an inventory, we first need to know how to read nameplates, which are the stickers on the rear panels or interior of HVAC units. And these nameplates provide key information such as manufacturer, model and serial number, refrigerant type, and refrigerant charge. And you can actually go to your household refrigerator after this, look inside, and find your nameplate. So nameplates are usually pretty easy to read and they display information clearly, but in a very small text size. So when conducting an inventory, when going around to all the buildings on your campus, it can be helpful to take pictures of these name tags and zoom in when entering these data onto a spreadsheet. And you can see that we've labeled the information here. You can look at this more in depth on your own time as well. In some cases, especially on compressor racks, often seen in university dining halls, refrigerant information might not be as clearly displayed as we saw in the previous slide, which is a standalone fridge used in a kitchen. So refer to your refrigerant technician for this information. And for this Copeland compressor used in one of our compressor racks at Yale, we had to talk to a refrigerant technician who knew more about the equipment. So now I'll turn it back to Dan, who will talk about refrigerant asset inventory and some helpful tips that he's encountered while doing these himself. Thank you.
Thank you, Tilden. My name is Dan Smith. I'm the energy manager for Bard College, and Tilden and I are teaming up on this presentation. So here we'll be focusing on the actual refrigerant asset inventory. How do we get from the nuts, the regulation down to the nuts and bolts of your building or your campus? And we'll just go through some helpful tips. So next slide, Tilden, please. So you've decided to conduct a refrigerant asset inventory. This may seem like a daunting task. There may be many buildings that on your campus that you're responsible for. There's lots of equipment peppered all over campus. So locating the equipment, and then you have to collect the nameplate data and then tabulate it, bring it back to your office and organize it. So where do you begin? I suggest first go talk to the HVAC team, the managers and technicians. They are the closest to this type of equipment and are usually the most knowledgeable. They may have some documentation that can really set you on your way, depending on what sort of record keeping they've taken. They may have building lists, equipment logs. They may have advice, and they may even say, "This sounds like fun. I'd love to assist you with your audit." And which brings to the next point is to team up. Build a team to help conduct this inventory. So divide and conquer to split up the buildings or areas of campus, determine roles. Maybe someone will be taking the pictures while somebody, has the keys and is, keying into the doors or, navigating with the map. So it helps to divide up the roles. Next slide. So first you're going to want to, before you even leave your office, determine the scope, boundary, and the priority. So which assets are you going to prioritize and look for? The very obvious examples are to look for the largest equipment on campus. That's the big capital equipment for process cooling or chillers for building conditioning, heat pumps, split systems. Those are obviously the ones we really want to capture. And then if we start kind of whittling down into smaller equipment, window units, food refrigerators in the break rooms, mini fridges in offices or dorm buildings, even vehicles in your fleet, vending machines, who may be owned by the campus or an outside vendor. Take time to know what is the value of going for these smaller units. As we've learned from some of the other speakers, there may be good solutions or new alternative refrigerants already in place in these. So what is the value of organizing and capturing these versus your time and the organization? Of course, you might, it's always good to have a good inventory, but prioritizing the big equipment and moving down into, say, vending machines that have a very small amount of charge, maybe are less prone to leak and may already have an environmentally friendly refrigerant in them. Next slide. So again, before you even left the office to go out into the field, recommend speaking with anyone that you can who think might have some information, some documentation that can help you on your way. So, speaking with the HVAC team, speaking with the vehicle mechanics, a particular building may have some staff that just is familiar with the building. The purchasing department is a good stop on your inventory because your institution might work with an outside vendor to which, hey, we have a schedule of everything that we've purchased from them for the last 10 years. You may not have to go out into the field to capture these units if you know that there's already an inventory, and you can look at model numbers and maybe skip the point of going out to the building. You can have the model number and you can look up technical sheets and enter that into the equipment and saves yourself some time. And here, this chart to the right is just an example here at Bard College of how we've kind of broken this down. For example, refrigerators and freezers on campus, we would go speak to the purchasing manager because the HVAC technicians generally don't work on this this kind of equipment. If a refrigerator is broke, it usually gets replaced. However, the HVAC team is definitely the right place to go for, say, a large process chiller. Next slide. So you're getting ready to go out into the field, and some helpful things on your journey will be to gather a list of buildings. So figure out everywhere where you're going to go, a campus map, and some building floor plans, perhaps if you need them, some drawings. So go out with a clear plan and check out as you visit each building. So chart a path. Next slide. So as you're out in the field, everybody organizes information differently, so do what works best for you. But here's just a tip that I found is helpful, and that's to take lots of photos as you go. And you will thank yourself later if that piece of paper on your clipboard gets caught in the rain and the ink starts running, or you misplace it. When you take a photo, you can take almost infinite photos these days. It gets stored, it's backed up, and you don't have to spend time in the field looking at a nameplate and taking down all of the information on paper. So I suggest, as you're going through your campus, to as you reach a building to take an establishing shot of the building. And then as you move into a room with equipment, take an establishing shot of that equipment. And then after that, zoom photos of the nameplates, per piece of equipment. And just as an example here, to the right, here's a picture of our museum. And as I enter the chiller room, so I can see which equipment I'm looking at, and then 1, 2 nameplates. Because if you just go through and take pictures of nameplates with no break to show where your building is, and you lose track of which order you went in, you're just gonna have a bunch of nameplates, and you won't be able to attribute a building to it later on when you go to enter your data. It still always helps to have a clipboard in your hand just to track your progress and bring all that data back to the office where you can sit down and enter it. Next slide. A piece of helpful information would be construction drawings and equipment schedules. This might be a big time saver. Searching through an entire building, you have to look up and down for stuff that might be buried in the walls. If you have a good drawing, you can quickly identify all the different types of equipment. So you can see the ID and the model names and see a naming schedule. You can look through the drawing and actually make counts of how many are out there rather than going to each dormitory room. You'll get the basic model info where you can potentially reverse look up through an online search some technical information. However, I still recommend that you take a nameplate for each type of equipment that you can see on the drawing, because sometimes the drawing schedule doesn't have the refrigerant info. It's usually something that doesn't make it on the construction drawings. So the refrigerant type and the volume are usually not on construction drawings, so you'll still need a nameplate, but you can just get 1 per piece of equipment. Next. And these are just some examples, and this can be a time saver if these are readily available. So you might not have to go to the building. If you can get a model name, you can do an online search for the technical sheet. And here's some other examples. You can literally go through and count the number and types of units. Of course, there's a trade-off here of your search time for searching for drawings, but that may be, you'll find a balance between being out in the field and looking through documentation. Next. So you will undoubtedly have missing data or gaps. There will be nameplates that might be missing, or there's this picture on the right that is a nameplate that has been bleached to being illegible. That sometimes they just become mirrors where all of the data is just gone. So what you can do here is you've now collected so much nameplate data, and you're getting so good at looking at the system size and the types and the models that even though you have a gap on 1 piece of equipment, its rough size, and you can make an estimate of how much volume, and based on its vintage, what type of refrigerant it might have. And you can make a note that, this is an estimate, but it's never going to be perfect. And when you're out in the field, it helps to be a detective and to look for clues. For instance, you might see some notes from a technician where they may have put in a substitute or put in a different weight. There might be a little service ticket on the side that can give you one. Here's some examples where in this yellow circle, they've put in a substitute refrigerant. And you can always take this information back and do an online search for the technical manuals. So you've gone out into the field, you have all your photos, you're very organized, entering your asset data now. Here are some of the options for you. An Excel spreadsheet. I know there's lots of people who get really excited for building Excel spreadsheets. If you're like myself, you can make yourself a custom one with all the parameters that you want to collect, the very minimum info. or you can get as detailed as you want. Maybe you want to capture power equipment or power data as well if you want to do an energy audit. There's refrigerant tracking software. A quick Google search, you can find now there's a growing number of online free trials versus paywall. And perhaps your institution already has a asset managing system where you have lots of assets that you're managing, and you can modify this system to add refrigerant data, like the type of refrigerant and the weight, and maybe you can print out some nice reports. So next slide. Here's just a quick example of what we have used. We're still ongoing in this effort. So a quick shout out to TrackRef that we are piloting with. I won't endorse it. There are so many different softwares out there, but this is just one particular one. Next slide.
Just a notice, we've got about 4 minutes left for the whole webinar.
Well, I will send it back to Tilden.
Thanks, Deb and Dan, and we'll make sure this is quick because I know you folks have lots of things to do. But the next point that we want to make is, we conducted an inventory and you now have all these great data. What do you do when after that? Well, you can do two main things. The first is to develop new strategies to maintain or replace your HVAC/R equipment. And the second is to calculate estimated environmental impact. And let's talk about that now. So using a program such as Microsoft Excel, you can basically input the data that you find. And let's say you have a hypothetical compressor in this case that has about 30 pounds or 14 kilograms of refrigerant. And you can look up the GWP, the global warming potential over 20 years, numbers that are available on the internet based on climate science. And you can also estimate your leak rate based on historical data, how much refrigerant you're adding, which is roughly equal to the amount of refrigerant loss. From technician estimates or from EPA guidelines, just to estimate your leak rate. You can calculate then CO2 equivalent. So the equivalent emissions from your refrigerant emissions in CO2. And that's just some simple spreadsheet math. So you take the global warming potential, you multiply that by the annual leaks in kilograms, and you divide by 1,000 to find CO2 equivalent in metric tons. And you can note that just a little bit of refrigerant leakage in this case has the same environmental impact as the emissions over 1 calendar year from 2 cars. So you can imagine how these emissions really add up across campuses. And beyond just the spreadsheet math, we have a few strategic next steps as well. The first is to prioritize replacement of leaky HVAC units that have high global warming potential with large charge sizes. The next is that when units are replaced, assure that your maintenance team purchases energy efficient options that use climate-friendly refrigerants. And lastly, keep inventory documents updated and organized. It's important to have living documents that you can update and have a new record and updated record to make your most informed purchasing decisions as possible. And lastly, for future discussion, we couldn't get to everything today, but if you want to contact Kristen, who spoke today, Dan, Lori, or me to talk more about refrigerant inventories, we'd be happy to do that. And if you want to read a written summary of what we talked about today, you can visit www.yalerefrigerantinitiative.org/inventory, where we wrote up a summary of what we talked about today. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll turn it back to Deb and Daita to take this up. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. So you will be getting the slides, you'll be getting the recording. Maybe Tilden, if you want to take those contacts on the last slide and just go ahead and put them into the chat now. So if people want to reach out with questions, they've got that contact info. I think that we've answered all the questions. James is typing an answer to the last one that was in the questions and answers. I think this has been an amazing presentation in terms of giving you useful information to take next steps. And that's what this is about. This is about, let's take the information and take the steps so that we can get rid of these high greenhouse gas impacts that none of us can afford. And we're here to support you in that. And that's why we've shared our contact information. So if you've got another burning question and you want to put it into the question and answers, we'll try and harvest those and share it out with the presenters. But I think that we are good unless we have closing comments from any of the speakers. Oh, you aren't seeing me. Sorry, here I am. Closing comments from any of you? Or did you already share what you wanted to share?
I'm more than happy to talk with anyone if they have questions about how to get a program set up. You know, you can send me an email.
Fantastic. What an offer. Okay. Any other closing comments? Here's what I say, go take that cooling pledge, right? And dig into this. Don't let this fall off your plate because you're busy with other things. This is just too important. And who would have known that refrigerants would have ended up being so high on our priority list? Having taught heating and cooling and refrigeration technicians for 41 years, I know that this is doable. We may have to educate our contractors. We're going to have to change our procurement, and we can do that. That's what higher ed's about, is to learn ourselves and then share it out with the community so that we can shift the norms. We can't afford to wait for the new regulations to come into effect. We have to do the right thing now. All right.
Thank you so much, Deborah, Tilden, and all of our presenters. I will just share one last thing. We have almost weekly webinars, and I'm going to share here the next 3 ones. They may not be the best format in the chat, but we have another HIASC webinar coming up on June 30th on the circular economy. So that will also be a very interesting conversation. And we also have the grandson of Mahatma Gandhi on the webinar on July 7th. So working with vulnerable communities on climate action through non-formal higher education and peace building. So that one will also be a very interesting conversation. So I encourage you to check out our calendar of events coming up, webinars, workshops, courses, and of course our annual conference, and hope to see you soon on one of our events. So thank you so much again, everyone, and thank you to our attendees for joining us today. Have a good day, everyone. Bye.